Hello, I'm Ellen Sandbeck, head worm wrangler for Laverme's Worms. Today I'm going to tell you and show you how to set up your worm bin when you receive your worms. I just dumped 4 gallons of peat moss into the muck bucket so I can mix it. It's almost impossible to mix 4 gallons of peat moss and get it wet in a 5-gallon bucket. So we add the cup of sand, because worms don't have teeth, they have gizzards, and chickens have gizzards and they use little pieces of gravel to grind up the food. Worms are way too small for gravel, they grind up their food with sand. So add the sand, and then we add agricultural lime. This is actually pelletized, which means it's not dusty, which is great. You have to use agricultural grade lime, because if you use slaked lime, you can burn the skin right off your hands or burn out your eyeballs. So agricultural grade limestone. The lime is for the worm's calciferous glands, which is that sort of collar around the worm's body, which secretes mucus and calcium, and without it the worms cannot reproduce, so you need calcium. You can use crushed up eggshells if you like, but I'm using, we don't need enough eggs to do it as much lime as I need. So just mix that up a bit so it's not all in one place. Next, I start adding water. And yes, this is our kitchen. It's very windy and rainy outside today. So we're doing this in the kitchen, and this will not be the first or last time I do this in the kitchen. Just add some water. And you cannot use dry peat moss in a worm bin, because any very fine-grained dry material will suffocate the worms because it sticks to their skin and prevents them from breathing. So we want to get this peat moss to be moist but not soggy. Moist means you can actually pick up a handful of peat moss and squeeze and you'll get a little bit of moisture out of it. Peat moss, even after you've added water and set up your worm bin, it takes quite a long time for it to really be completely moist. So usually people do not get worm juice out of their bin for a few months after they first set it up. See, this isn't completely mixed in with water yet. We don't want anything looking light colored and dry like that. The worms can handle extra moisture better than they can handle being dried out. And even though this peat moss is going to look quite wet, by tomorrow it will not look that wet at all. It keeps sucking up moisture for a long time. It's looking pretty good. And now I'm going to add what I call worm juice, which is actually the leachate that comes out of a bin. Worm juice, and about a tablespoon of blackstrap molasses added to the worm juice. The blackstrap molasses feeds the bacteria that are in the worm juice, and it helps jumpstart the activity in the worm bin. If you don't inoculate the bin this way, it takes many months longer for the bin to actually come to a balance and be working. I'm just mixing it in so it's not just a blob of molasses in the bottom. The reason I don't add the worm juice in the beginning is because I don't want to dry out the bacteria in the worm juice by adding it to dry peat moss. Also, ooh, look at that. See the fuzz? I can guarantee you if I left this on the counter overnight, it would froth out completely out of the cup by morning, because once you start feeding that bacteria, they start growing like crazy. And they make a huge amount of carbon dioxide, and it starts looking like a root beer float. And as with everything else I've learned in my time, I learned that the hard way. Okay, I'll just mix that in. So this is our standard household size worm bin. It's 27 gallons. It's a very nice size to run. Bins that are smaller than this are actually more difficult to run. The smaller the bin, the harder it is to run, because you don't have enough space for things to get momentum. So this is the lid. It has holes in it for ventilation. If you have a cat in the household, you have to use the lid. Otherwise, you don't have to use the lid. The ventilation holes are so that the worms don't suffocate, because worms do need air. This black plastic we put on top of the surface of the bedding, and that keeps the moisture down in the worm compost and also convinces the worms to stay in the bin as opposed to wandering out of the bin. Because a dried out worm is a dead worm. Okay, so this is the filter system in the bin. This is the spigot that's taped to the inside so it doesn't bang around in transit. Take that off. And then you have to gently flip up the filter system. Take the nut off of the spigot. Leave the washer. The spigot on the outside. Put on the nut. And then you want to turn it so it's facing down. And this spigot is in off position. On position is like that. I strongly suggest you leave it draining all the time with a container underneath. It's just handy to be able to turn it off when you're moving the thing. Then you put this cap with the notch on the bottom. Just put it over the inside of where the nut is, and that helps keep dirt from falling into the spigot. And then you put the filter back down, and there you go. Now I'm going to put bedding in. There's some dry spots here, but not too bad. Even it out, then put in the worms. When you receive worms through the mail, they're actually packed in one of our old t-shirts. There we go. Everybody out. You can gently level it out. Dive down. Often when worms have been in transit, they get upset and disoriented and they will want to leave the bin. And one way to prevent that is to feed them some liquefied food, which is really fast and easy for them to eat, so it convinces them to stay in the bin. So what we are going to do now is we're going to leave the plastic off so the light will convince them to dive down. And we're going to liquefy some of our kitchen waste to feed them. Okay, we've got it. Now, I will talk a little bit about how to feed. In a bin this size, you can feed in a rotation of 6. So mentally divide the bin into 6. So you feed week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5, week 6. So when you get back to week where you started, it's been 7 weeks and everything should be pretty much gone. The newer the bin, the less you can feed, because you have fewer worms, less bacteria, less matrix to bury the food cleanly in. One of the main things you want to think about when you're feeding is not to overfeed. You don't want food just out in the air. You want everything cleanly buried. So the newer the bin, the less you can feed, because you have to be able to bury it cleanly. So you don't go all the way to the bottom ever. You stay about an inch off the bottom. You start digging your hole. This is about the volume of food that you should be able to be feeding to start with, so you can bury cleanly.
How much?
Huh? So here we go. Nice liquidy stuff, which will make the worms very happy and convince them to stay in the bin.
Okay. Go.
1 carrot got left behind. That will not be a problem. It will break down eventually. In 6 weeks it will be gone. The rest of it will be gone in a couple days. So they're buried cleanly. No food in the air. If you can see any actual food on the surface, you are going to get fruit flies for sure. So you don't want to do that. And then you put dry leaves as bedding. You add carbon to the mix, and the fresh food adds nitrogen to the mix, and you need both. Then you put the black plastic right on top of the leaves, loosely, because the worms get the air from the top. So you don't want it to be sucked right down to the surface. You want air to be able to go under. And then if you have cats in the household, you put your lid on. You don't have to snap it on, but just enough to keep the cat from using it as a litter box. And there you go. You do want to have it set up on something so that you can actually drain the liquid out. And you want to put it on a sturdy surface of some kind. You can use concrete blocks or something. What you don't want to have to do is lift it up every time you need to drain it, because when this bin is full, it will weigh well over 100 pounds and it's not good for your back. So just put it up on something and plan to leave it in that space. I strongly recommend you leave it in your basement year-round and don't put it out for summer vacations. It's not good for the worms.